2 a.m. you wake up for no reason. Not from a nightmare, not from a noise you can name, just awake. In the modern world, that's insomnia. You'd call a doctor, but for most of human history that wasn't a disorder. That was Tuesday. Ancient humans didn't sleep in one long, unbroken block the way we're told is normal. They woke in the middle of the night on purpose every single night for tens of thousands of years. And what they did in that gap between sleeps might explain more about human psychology than anything happening in the daylight hours. Let's start with the assumption everyone carries into this topic without questioning it. 8 hours straight through, lights out to alarm clock. That's the model we've been handed as the biological gold standard, and it's the model modern sleep medicine still measures people against. Miss it and you're told something is wrong with you. But here's the problem. That model is barely 2 centuries old, and it may not even be the model our bodies were built for. Let's bring up the historian who first noticed this, because the discovery itself is a genuinely good story. Roger Eckert spent over a decade combing through diaries, court records, medical texts, and literature from pre-industrial Europe, and he kept finding the same strange phrase over and over. First sleep, not a typo, not a regional quirk. Hundreds of documents spanning centuries all casually referencing a first sleep and a second sleep, with something happening in between. People wrote about waking after their first sleep to pray, to talk with a bed partner, to tend a fire, to think, and then returning to a second sleep before morning. This wasn't described as unusual. It was described the way you describe having breakfast. This is where the term biphasic sleep comes in, meaning sleep broken into 2 distinct segments rather than one continuous block. And the evidence for it isn't just anecdotal diary entries. Sleep researcher Thomas Weyer ran an experiment in the 1990s that's become one of the most cited studies in this entire field. He took a group of modern participants and deprived them of artificial light for extended periods, mimicking the natural light-dark cycle of a world before electricity. Within weeks, their sleep spontaneously split into 2 segments, with a period of quiet wakefulness in between lasting roughly 1 to 2 hours. Nobody taught them to do this. Their bodies did it on their own, the moment artificial light was removed from the equation. That's the part worth sitting with. This isn't a cultural habit that pre-industrial people invented and modern people abandoned. It's a default physiological pattern that modern lighting actively suppressed. We didn't evolve past biphasic sleep. We engineered it out of existence with the light bulb, and we did it so thoroughly that most people alive today have never experienced their own body's natural rhythm. Let's bring up something genuinely important here, because this pattern isn't only documented in European sources, and that matters for how confident we can be that it's a deep human default rather than a regional quirk. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer groups with minimal exposure to artificial light, including populations in Tanzania, Namibia, and Bolivia, have found something that directly echoes Eckert's European archives. These groups don't show a rigid biphasic split the way pre-industrial European diaries describe, but they consistently sleep in a way that's far more flexible and segmented than the industrial standard, waking briefly multiple times through the night, active during some portion of it, largely unbothered by the interruptions. None of these groups have a word that translates cleanly to insomnia. The concept doesn't map onto their experience of the night because broken sleep was never framed as a problem in the first place. It was simply what a night was. This connects to something worth bringing up about siesta traditions as well, because they may be a related but distinct adaptation to a different problem. Cultures across the Mediterranean, Latin America, and parts of Southeast Asia develop midday rest periods, and while heat avoidance is the most commonly cited explanation, some researchers argue the deeper driver is closer to a circadian dip that most human bodies naturally experience in the early afternoon, regardless of climate. Industrial scheduling suppressed this the same way it suppressed the nightly waking window. We didn't stop having a body that wants 2 rest periods across a 24-hour cycle. We stopped living in a culture that permits it. Here's something that makes this even harder to dismiss as a purely cultural artifact. Segmented sleep isn't unique to humans. Look across the animal kingdom, and consolidated unbroken sleep is actually the unusual pattern, not the default. Many mammals sleep in short bursts spread across a 24-hour period rather than one long block. Even our closest primate relatives show sleep patterns that are considerably more fragmented than the idealized human 8 hours. This doesn't prove ancient humans definitely slept exactly the way European peasants did in the 1500s, but it does suggest that a single, unbroken nightly sleep block is, evolutionarily speaking, a somewhat unusual arrangement, and one that a species without electric light had little reason to evolve toward in the first place. Let's talk about what that gap in the middle of the night actually was for, because a period of nightly wakefulness only makes sense as a survival strategy if it did something useful, and the evidence suggests it did several things at once. The first and most obvious function was vigilance. Ancient humans slept in environments with real predators, real rival groups, and real environmental threats that didn't stop existing just because the sun went down. A species that slept in one deep, unbroken block for 8 hours was a species that spent 8 hours completely unaware of its surroundings, which is an extraordinarily dangerous strategy in an environment with large carnivores. A species that woke naturally partway through the night, alert enough to listen, assess, and react, had a meaningful survival advantage. This wasn't insomnia. This was a built-in check the perimeter function running automatically every single night without anyone having to consciously decide to stay alert. A species that woke naturally partway through the night had a built-in solution to this problem baked directly into its sleep architecture. You didn't need someone to stay awake all night on watch, exhausting themselves and weakening the group's collective alertness the next day. You needed a species that woke up periodically as a default setting, checked the fire, checked the perimeter, and went back to sleep. Biphasic sleep may not have just coexisted with firekeeping, it may have been shaped by it. Let's bring up something genuinely underappreciated here, which is what this gap in the night actually felt like from the inside, based on both the historical record and modern experimental replications. Where study participants didn't describe the waking period as stressful or frustrating, the way a modern person lying awake at 2 a.m. typically does. They described it as calm, almost meditative. Researchers measured elevated levels of prolactin during this period, a hormone associated with relaxation and calm alertness, similar to the state some people report during deep meditation. This wasn't restless insomnia. It was a distinct third state of consciousness, neither fully asleep nor fully awake in the way daytime wakefulness is, and it appears to have been a completely normal, even pleasant, part of the human night for most of our species' existence. This matters because modern insomnia and this ancient waking period are being treated as the same thing when they may be almost opposite experiences. A modern person who wakes at 2 a.m. is usually anxious about it, because they've been told this shouldn't be happening, that it's a malfunction, that they need to force themselves back to sleep immediately or suffer the consequences the next day. That anxiety itself may be manufacturing the distress. Ancient humans waking at the same hour weren't fighting the experience, they were using it. Which brings us to what the historical record says people actually did during this window, because it wasn't just lying there. Eckertsch's research found consistent evidence of specific activities filling this gap. Quiet conversation with a bed partner, often described in unusually intimate or reflective terms, the kind of talk that doesn't happen during the business of daytime life. Prayer and religious reflection, showing up constantly in diaries and religious texts referencing this specific hour as spiritually significant. Interpreting dreams from the first sleep while they were still fresh before a second sleep potentially overwrote them. Low-intensity tasks that didn't require full daytime alertness, tending the fire, checking on children, minor household repairs. Some medical texts of the era even recommended this window specifically for conception, on the theory that a calmer, more rested state produced better outcomes than end-of-day exhaustion. Let's bring up something genuinely interesting connecting this to dream psychology, because the timing here isn't incidental. Modern sleep science has established that REM sleep, the phase associated with vivid dreaming, becomes longer and more frequent in the later portions of a sleep cycle. A first sleep followed by a waking period would have placed ancient humans in a position to wake directly out of a REM-heavy sleep phase, with dream content still vivid and accessible, and then have an hour or two of calm wakefulness in which to consciously process it before drifting into a second sleep. Some researchers have speculated that this rhythm may have functioned as a built-in dream integration system, one that modern unbroken sleep quietly eliminated. We didn't just lose a sleep pattern. We may have lost a nightly window for psychological processing that an unbroken 8 hours simply doesn't provide in the same way. Now let's address the obvious question, which is what actually changed. Because if this was the default human sleep pattern for tens of thousands of years, something significant had to happen to erase it as thoroughly as it's been erased. The answer, according to Eckertsch and most sleep historians who have studied this, comes down almost entirely to artificial light. Specifically, the spread of cheap, reliable artificial lighting through the late 18th and 19th centuries, first through improved oil lamps and street lighting, and then decisively through electric light. Before this, night was night. Genuinely dark, genuinely quiet, activity limiting in a way that modern people, surrounded by streetlights and glowing screens, rarely experience even at 3 a.m. as artificial light spread. Evenings extended later, bedtimes compressed, and the natural two-phase sleep pattern that had prevailed for the entire span of human history began to collapse into the single consolidated block we now consider standard, not because it's biologically optimal, but because it fit better into an industrializing world that increasingly valued long, uninterrupted, schedulable blocks of both work and rest. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it means the sleep pattern most people today consider correct and measure their own sleep against with real anxiety when they fall short of it is a historically recent industrial adaptation, not a deep evolutionary baseline. The baseline was biphasic. The consolidated 8-hour block is the anomaly, not the other way around. Let's bring up something genuinely important about what this means for modern people who still wake up in the middle of the night, because this reframes an experience that a huge number of people currently treat as a medical problem. If you wake naturally somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning, calm, alert, not desperately trying to fall back asleep, but simply awake for a while before drifting off again, you are not malfunctioning. You are, in a very real physiological sense, doing exactly what humans did for most of our species' existence, before we told ourselves it was wrong. The anxiety many people now feel about this waking period, the frantic sleep-tracking apps, the catastrophizing about tomorrow's productivity, may be a distinctly modern problem layered on top of an ancient and previously unremarkable biological pattern. This deserves one more layer, because the sleep-tracking industry specifically has quietly made this worse in a way that's worth naming directly. Modern sleep trackers are built around the 8-hour consolidated model as the definition of success, and they generate a nightly score based on how closely your sleep matches that model. A person who wakes naturally for 40 minutes in the middle of the night, calm and unbothered, gets a device notification the next morning telling them their sleep was poor. That notification creates anxiety about an event that, for most of human history, wasn't considered a problem at all. In a strange way, we've built technology that manufactures distress out of a pattern our own bodies may still be quietly trying to return to. The tracker isn't wrong that your sleep looked different from 8 consolidated hours. It's wrong about what that difference means. This doesn't mean every case of nighttime wakefulness is this ancient pattern reasserting itself. Genuine insomnia, driven by stress, screens, caffeine, or underlying health conditions, is a real and different problem, and it's worth taking seriously rather than assuming it's simply ancestral biology reawakening. But the specific experience of calm, natural waking in the middle of the night followed by a return to sleep is different from that, and treating every instance of it as pathological may be doing more harm than the waking itself ever did. Let's zoom out and connect this to something we've discussed before regarding ancient group survival more broadly, because biphasic sleep fits into a larger pattern we keep finding across nearly every dimension of ancient human life. Ancient humans were not simply enduring their environment, they were continuously adapted to it, in ways that were often more sophisticated than the version of themselves modern popular imagination gives them credit for. A sleep pattern that provided built-in nightly vigilance, a natural firekeeping rhythm, and a calm psychological processing window wasn't an accident or a hardship. It was a finely tuned solution to the actual conditions of pre-industrial night, conditions that included real danger, real darkness, and the real practical necessity of keeping a fire alive until morning. So how did ancient humans survive without sleep schedules? The honest answer is that they didn't need a schedule because their bodies already had one, built directly into their biology rather than imposed from outside. A first sleep, a calm waking window used for vigilance, connection, reflection, and dream processing, and a second sleep, all shaped by a natural dark light cycle that had governed human life for the entire span of our species' existence, right up until artificial light quietly rewired it within the last 200 years. We didn't lose this pattern because it stopped working. We lost it because we built a world bright enough to override it. And every time you wake at 2 a.m., calm and alert for no obvious reason, you're not broken. You're remembering something your body never actually forgot.